It started with a whisper, cold, sharp, like a blade sliding across silk. "Sir, we need you to move to the back." She didn't shout, she didn't explain. Just stood there, arms crossed, lips tight, eyes fixed on him like he didn't belong. The cabin lights glowed soft gold as passengers filed in, some already drifting into drowsy silence. In seat 2A, near the window, the man didn't even blink. He folded his newspaper once, slowly, looked up. A black t-shirt, camo pants, calm face. Nothing about him screamed power. No designer luggage, no gold watch, no entourage. But something about his stillness made the air around him feel heavier. Across the aisle, a French woman in her 50s grumbled as she adjusted her scarf, impatient, entitled. She turned sharply toward the flight attendant. "You said there would be space. This is business class. Do something." The flight attendant nodded quickly, then turned back to the man in 2A and pointed. That's when the travail began to crack. Passengers nearby shifted, watched, waited. Some already sensing it. This wasn't going to end the way she thought, because the man in 2A, he wasn't just another passenger. And by the time this flight touched the ground, everyone on board would remember his name. He didn't like suits. He said they made him feel like a stranger in his own skin, too polished, too tight, too far from the dust and breath of his people. So even on the day he stepped into the Élysée Palace, seated across from diplomats in 1,000-euro ties, Ibrahim Traoré wore a plain black t-shirt beneath a borrowed blazer. He took it off the second the cameras stopped rolling. You see, Burkina Faso's president, barely in his 30s, forged from soil, sweat, and the stubborn fire of revolution. He wasn't born into power. He carved his way toward it through the chaos of forgotten borders and the silence of betrayed promises. From a soldier sleeping under torn canvas to a man standing before world leaders demanding Africa's gold back, he had never once asked for applause. And now, as the cold Paris wind brushed against the collar of his jacket, Traoré stepped out of the embassy car alone. No convoy, no bodyguards, just a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. At Charles de Gaulle Airport, he moved like water through stone, a ghost among noise. Security didn't stop him. No one glanced twice at the man in camouflage pants and scuffed boots. He looked like he belonged to the background. That's exactly how he liked it. The terminal pulsed with chatter, rolling luggage wheels, overhead announcements in clipped French. But Traoré moved slowly, calmly. Not like someone in a rush, but like someone who had already arrived. He passed cafe windows glowing yellow with espresso steam, watched a child press her nose to the glass as if looking out into a new world. He smiled, softly, briefly. Even after an exhausting 14-hour negotiation, about sovereignty, about stolen gold, about the weight of silence, he had no security detail. No press, no fanfare, just a boarding pass, seat 2A, business class. And so when he stepped onto that Air France jet, nodded to the stewardess at the door and tucked his bag beneath the seat, he was just another man in a black t-shirt with dust on his boots and a passport no one respected. Not yet. The heels came first, sharp, commanding. Every step a punctuation mark across the jet bridge. Then came the scarf, Hermès, pastel pink, arranged with surgical precision. And finally the voice, clipped, nasal, practiced in boardrooms and five-star lobbies. "Excuse me, this isn't what I requested." She didn't need to say her name. The air changed the moment she entered. Flight attendants straightened up. A young steward scrambled to recheck the manifest. This was Madeleine Rousseau, CEO of one of France's top private wealth firms. Old money, older ego. She had booked late, expecting that her status would override that minor inconvenience called fully booked. The crew knew the type, not just entitled with connections. "Business class is full, madame," the flight attendant said softly. Madeleine tilted her head, just slightly, the way someone might when trying to hear a joke they're sure they won't find funny. "Then make room." In the galley near the cockpit, two attendants exchanged glances. The chief purser, a woman in her late 40s with hair pinned into a severe knot and eyeliner drawn like a blade, sighed. Her name was Corinne Duvet, 15 years with Air France, thousands of flights, and a quiet reputation for handling situations discreetly, the kind where the passenger's skin color seemed to always correlate with the word problem. She wouldn't say she was racist. She'd never say that. But Corinne had grown used to a certain pattern. She noticed it, leaned into it, maybe not out loud, but in the small decisions. Who she offered champagne to first, who she smiled at, who she forgot to refill. And when she walked down the aisle now, scanning for a solution, her gaze drifted naturally, instinctively, toward the man in the seat 2A. Black, alone, quiet, no luxury luggage, no jacket. Easy. She leaned slightly toward the young steward. If someone's going to move, she said under her breath, it won't be her. He hesitated. She didn't. Her heels clicked once, twice, and then she stood beside him, seat 2A, expression already flattened into practiced authority. Sir, she said, voice smooth as steel, you'll need to move. Seat 2A. The man in black didn't move. He just slowly looked up, like someone waking from a calm dream. The cabin light hit his face in soft angles. No anger, no confusion, just a kind of measured curiosity. The purser, Corinne Duvet, shifted her weight forward, clipboard pressed tight to her chest. Sir, she said firm, but rehearsed, there's been a seating issue. I'm going to ask you to relocate to economy, just for this flight. He didn't speak. Her fingers tightened slightly on the clipboard. The silence pressed back. Finally, he blinked once, then spoke, voice steady, low, and unshaken. Why me? Corinne hesitated just a beat too long. She'd expected compliance, not a question. I selected a passenger at random, monsieur. Random? His eyes scanned the rows in business class. 10 seats, all full. 7 white men, 1 white woman, 1 older gentleman, asleep, and him. Did you ask any of them to move? Corinne opened her mouth, closed it. I made a judgment call, sir. You looked more flexible. Flexible? He let the word float in the air. Passengers were now listening, pretending to read, to sleep, to scroll, but ears were tilted his way. I wear a t-shirt, so I'm flexible. I travel alone, so I'm flexible. I don't look like your usual guest in this section, so I must be easy to move. I didn't mean it like that, she snapped. A little too fast. He leaned back slowly, head tilting just slightly. But you did. His tone didn't rise. Didn't need to. It cut anyway. You made a decision the moment I boarded, not based on ticket or rules or fairness. You saw what I looked like, and you chose what you thought you could get away with. She straightened. You're making this into something it's not. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Then explain what it is. Corinne took a step back, breath shallow. Eyes flicked toward the galley, her confidence cracked. Passengers now visibly paused, watching more openly. Across the aisle, Madeleine Rousseau watched too, arms crossed, lips curled. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The purser turned, retreated, but not defeated, just redirected. She scanned the rows again, and her gaze landed on a black woman in seat 3F, young, well-dressed, nervous eyes flicking between them. Excuse me, mademoiselle, Corinne began again, tone clipped. We'll need you to adjust your seat assignment at... The woman blinked, startled. I paid for this seat. But Corinne leaned in, voice sharp. Don't make this difficult. From his seat, Traoré said nothing, but his gaze moved, slow, deliberate, from Corinne to the woman in 3F and back. The injustice was no longer private, it was public, humming beneath every silence. No one spoke. Not yet. But someone at the back lowered their phone from their ear. Another tilted their camera. The moment had weight now. And still the man in seat 2A didn't raise his voice because he knew. Real power never has to. The cabin settled into the stillness of cruise altitude. Overhead lights dimmed to a golden hush, like the soft glow of a hotel lobby at midnight. Engines hummed low. Seatbelt signs blinked off. Some passengers slipped on headphones. Others reclined quietly, fingering silk eye masks or flipping through business magazines they'd never finish. At 2B, Madeleine Rousseau was draped in comfort, a glass of chilled Chablis in hand, a cashmere blanket unfolded for her like some ritual offering. The chief purser personally adjusted her seat with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dinner will be served shortly, Madame," Corinne whispered. And it was. She received her tray first. Silver cutlery, still warm, a delicate amuse-bouche resting like art on white porcelain. But in seat 2A, nothing arrived. No wine, no water, no blanket, no welcome. Ibrahim Traoré sat there, spine straight, hands folded in his lap. He wasn't surprised. He was prepared. With a quiet breath, he folded his newspaper, creased it clean down the middle, and set it aside. Then, without complaint, he turned to the window. Outside, night had swallowed the horizon. City lights below flickered like sparks on coal. The wing of the aircraft sliced through clouds like a silent blade. His reflection hovered in the glass, faint, half-shadowed. Inside, a thought whispered across his mind. They don't see the uniform beneath this shirt. Not the fatigue soaked in sweat. Not the boots worn through marches in the Sahel. Not the years of leading men through gunfire and betrayal and broken treaties. Not the title he never flaunted. President. They don't see the burden I carry. The maps, the debt, the gold, the people, the calls he must answer, the enemies he must outthink, the dreams he has no right to forget. They see a seat, a skin, a silence. They think it means I don't belong. And still, he didn't move, didn't raise his hand, didn't demand. He simply stared into the black sky, letting the stars blink back at him. A man at peace with discomfort. Not because it was fair, but because he'd faced worse and stayed standing. Far behind him, a young steward paused. Tray in hand, he looked towards seat 2A, hesitated, then kept walking. Because on this flight, kindness needed permission, and dignity was being tested in silence. The plane kissed the tarmac with a soft thud. Rubber met runway. A gentle jolt passed through the fuselage. Seatbelts clicked. Window shades lifted. Some passengers reached for their bags. Others yawned, stretching off the stiffness of a long flight. Business as usual, except for what waited outside. Through the oval windows, a scene unfolded. Not rushed, not chaotic, but composed like a chessboard. Military vehicles lined the private strip. Dark green uniforms gleamed under the floodlights. Berets tucked sharp over brows. Boots in perfect formation. The Burkina Faso flag waved solemnly in the evening wind, not for ceremony, but for truth. A black SUV rolled to the base of the boarding stairs and stopped with precision. Out stepped a senior officer, metals glinting, shoulders squared. He didn't look around, didn't adjust his coat. He already knew where to go. Inside the cabin, a flight attendant's voice chirped over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ouagadougou. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop." But no one heard the rest because the cabin door opened and the officer stepped inside. Silence dropped like a curtain. He moved past rows of suits and tired travelers, past the woman in 3F who still hadn't unclenched her jaw, past Madeleine Rousseau, whose wine had gone untouched for 30 minutes, until he stopped. At seat 2A, he straightened his spine, brought his hand to his chest, and spoke with a voice that filled every row. "Mr. President, welcome home." There was no drum roll, no trumpet, just the crack of reality snapping everyone to attention. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Heads turned, mouths opened, some in awe, others in shame. Corinne Duvet, the woman who had not offered him water, stumbled backward, clipboard trembling in her hand. The words "I didn't know" hung in her throat but never made it out. Madeleine's face drained to chalk. She reached for her bag as if it could somehow shield her from what she had just witnessed. But the man in 2A? He rose slowly. No need to adjust his shirt, no need to clear his throat. He nodded once to the officer, once to the cabin, and walked down the aisle without a word, like gravity had shifted in his direction. In that moment, everyone knew the man they'd tried to ignore was the man they'd never forget. The metal stairs hissed as his boots touched the tarmac. No applause, no red carpet, no speech, just silence and dignity. Traoré didn't look back, not at the cabin, Not at the woman who had humiliated him, not at the one who had demanded his seat like it was her birthright. He didn't need to, because what came next wasn't about him anymore. 2 steps behind, chaos bloomed. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Madeline's voice cracked like glass. I demand an explanation. Security didn't flinch. 4 officers in deep green uniforms moved in, swift, precise. One reached for her passport, another for her phone. You can't touch me. I'm a French citizen. But her words fell flat against stone faces. Authority here didn't speak with a Parisian accent. Corinne Duvet stumbled down behind her, the clipboard now a useless shield in her arms. She turned to the captain, to the tarmac, to anyone who would listen. I didn't know, he never said he was the president, but ignorance wasn't innocence, and silence had already judged her. Crowds had gathered beyond the security cordon, airport staff, journalists, civilians, phones raised. Questions hissed through the warm air like sparks on dry grass. Who is she? What did they do? Did they touch the president? An aide whispered into a radio. Another read aloud a prepared statement. On behalf of the Republic of Burkina Faso, these individuals are being detained for investigation under charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, and insult to state leadership. Foreign interference will not be tolerated. We are a sovereign nation, not a colony, not anymore. Inside the French embassy, calls went out like wildfire, emails, press releases, apologies drafted, watered down, redacted. But the response from Ouagadougou was simple. No. No cover-up, no quiet settlement, no more bowing to flags that once flew above them like chains. And somewhere in the distance, not in a palace, not on a podium, but in a modest office beneath the warm lights of home, Ibrahim Traoré poured himself a glass of water, sat, opened a folder on infrastructure, and went back to work, because real leaders don't need revenge, they just need the space to build. The gates of Kaluba Palace opened as dust spilled across Ouagadougou. The city, still warm from the late afternoon sun, now simmered in quiet awe. Inside the presidential hall, no marble excess, no golden thrones, just maps, charts, blueprints of bridges, schools, and wells. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the head of a long wooden table. No fanfare, no announcement. His ministers had already gathered. They didn't ask about the plane, didn't bring up the woman, didn't even say welcome back. They just opened their folders and began. Because here, dignity was not a performance. It was policy. But beyond those palace walls, the world was no longer quiet. Videos leaked within hours. A passenger's blurry phone footage showed the moment the officer saluted. Mr. President, welcome home. That was all it took. By midnight, the clip had 10 million views. By dawn, it had 50. And C2A trended across continents. Headlines spilled from Nigeria to New York. African president humiliated, responds with grace. The man who didn't move and moved the world. Burkina Faso draws the line. Air France scrambled. At first, silence, then a formal apology. But silence wasn't enough anymore. Under growing pressure, they launched a full internal investigation. Thousands of complaints poured in. Former staff began to speak. Patterns emerged, old, ugly patterns dressed in polite uniforms. It wasn't just one flight. It wasn't just one purser. It had been happening for years. Within weeks, sweeping reforms rolled out. New bias awareness training, anonymous reporting channels, cabin camera audits, promotions linked to behavior, not just tenure. Change wasn't overnight, but it had begun, and it began with a man who said nothing. In West Africa, murals went up overnight. A painted figure in a black t-shirt, seated by a plain window, calm and proud. Beneath it, a simple phrase, "We do not move. We lead." And across boardrooms, classrooms, and comment sections, one question kept echoing. What if he had stood up? What if he had made a scene? But he didn't. He stayed seated. Because sometimes holding your ground is louder than raising your voice. And sometimes being underestimated is the most powerful thing in the world. He never raised his voice. He never showed his badge. He never reminded anyone who he was. Because true dignity doesn't need permission. It doesn't wear a crown. It doesn't ask to be seen. It simply sits, quiet, unshaken, unbought, until the world has no choice but to notice. Maybe that's the lesson. Not every battle is fought with fists. Not every leader needs a stage. And not every revolution begins with a roar. Sometimes it begins in seat 2A, with a man who refused to move, not because he couldn't, but because he shouldn't have to. So now we ask you, what would you have done on that flight? Would you have watched? Would you have spoken? Would you have moved? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it, because the more we talk about dignity, the harder it becomes to ignore.